In this section, we're going to more systematically talk about Ansible and configuration templating. So let's go ahead and review what we've previously talked about. We've previously talked about Jinja 2 templating or using Jinja 2 inside Ansible playbooks. We've also talked about using Jinja 2 and the template lookup. So you have some external file that contains Jinja 2. You use the template lookup to basically do some sort of operation on it. And the main operation we were showing was converting from one data structure to another data structure using Jinja 2. Now there's a third way we can use Jinja 2, and that is straight through the Python Jinja 2 templating module. So let's look at an example or several examples of this. So here I have a pretty simple playbook. I'm operating on the host Cisco. Now notice here I'm calling the template task, or the template module. So there's a module in Ansible that's dedicated for templating. Here I have my source Jinja 2 templating, or my source Jinja 2 template, and then I'm going to generate these config file. So basically for each member of the Cisco group, which in our case is the two routers, PyNet Router 1 and PyNet Router 2. We're going to use this source Jinja 2 template, and we're going to generate an end configuration file, which is going to be the inventory hostname .text, and it's going to be located in the configs directory. Now let's go look at this test template 1 file. So in this case, our Jinja 2 is just going to be IP name server, and it's going to be pulling the name server variable. And then let's find out where it's pulling that variable from. It's probably getting it from there. So there you see our name server 1 and name server 2. So for each of those two routers, we're just going to generate a end file in the configs directory using those two name server variables. Once again, if we go back into our Jinja 2 template, this double curly brace notation means we're referring to a variable. And then let's look at the configs directory. Let's actually remove everything from there. So we start with a clean slate. And now let's generate our files. And we see that we have generated our two files, and let's look at one of those two. So you can see we've rendered this output file. Now ultimately, with the end game being we could use this to push this configuration to the devices. But we're using the templating module to generate an output file. Now let's go ahead and look at a second example of this. Okay, so here I've expanded on it, and now I'm not just using the Cisco group, but I'm using the NXOS group and the Arista group, and I'm using this second template, and I'm going to generate all those config files, which in this case should correspond to 8 devices in there. Let's look at our test template 2, Jinja 2 template. Now you can start to see here I've embedded logic in this. So I say if the platform is iOS, use this syntax. If the platform is EOS, use this syntax. If the platform is NXOS, use this syntax. Once again here we're using a Jinja 2 if statement, which uses this curly brace % notation. Then I have an elif if it's EOS and an elif if it's NXOS. Now where is this platform variable getting pulled from? So the platform variable is getting pulled from group vars. You can see it here that I have a variable called platform, and in this case it's EOS. And if I go look at NXOS, you can see I have it defined there. So in each case, I'm defining those in the group vars directory and then file corresponding to the group. Okay, so now let's go ahead and once again remove everything in configs directory. Look at configs, there's nothing there. We'll go ahead and execute our playbook, generate those files. We generate it for all of those. Go in here and we say we've generated all these configs. And now let's look at what it looks like for NXOS. You can see I have IP name server. Let's look at what it looks like for Cisco IOS, and then let's see what it looks like for Arista. And there's what it looks like for Arista. So we're using the same playbook to generate a bunch of different output files, and we're using a conditional, a Jinja 2 conditional in our template file to differentiate between the configs that's in the case for iOS versus the configs that are in the case of EOS versus the case of NXOS. Now if we continue onward and look at template 3, so now let's look at a case where we have a for loop. So in the last case we had a conditional, but now let's look at a for loop. So here we're operating on the Arista group. We're using test template 3. All our configs are going to be generated into that configs directory using inventory hostname. And what does our third template look like? So in this case, I literally just have a bunch of Ethernets defined. There are no Jinja 2 constructs in here. So I'm going to just straight generate all these output ports. Go ahead and remove all that, all the previous configs, generate our new configs. We'll look at one of them, and you'll see we just generated all these output ports. So that's pretty boring. Let's look at expanding on that a little bit. So now I'm doing the exact same thing, except I'm calling test template 4. Once again, I'm operating on the Arista group. And in this case, I've converted all that individual ports into a for loop. So I have 4 port number in range. This range is going to generate the numbers 1 through 7. It's then going to stuff that into a variable called port number. So first time through the for loop, this port number is going to be 1. Second time through, it's going to be 2. It's then going to stick that number on the end. So it'll do interface Ethernet 1 with this underneath it. This is all just text. It'll go through the for loop the next time. It'll do interface Ethernet 2 with this all underneath it once again. And then it'll complete that all the way up to port number 8. Comes in here port number 7. And it generates this for port number 7. And then it completes the for loop. So we've converted the expanded form of that into a form using a for loop. And then here's our in for statement, once again using the curly brace % Jinja 2 notation. Execute that playbook. And now notice when I executed the template task, it said all my files are already correct. So what we had when we executed this with the template 3 playbook is exactly the same as what we have when we execute it for the template 4 playbook. So the output files are already entirely correct. Now if we go into configs and we remove all the files, regenerate them, you'll see that now they've all been regenerated. We can look at one of these and you can see once again it's blowing out all those configuration items. So you can see how you're doing configuration templating using a conditional. You can see how you're using configuration templating using a for loop. Now let's expand on this. So one item that's fairly undesirable about what we do in this template 4 is in our template, we have this just hard-coded. And what if we have different devices that don't just have Ethernet 1 through Ethernet 7? That's not really a great situation. So what I start to do in this case, in this template_5 situation, is I actually use napalm get facts to retrieve information about the device. And one of the things facts retrieves for us is actually the list of interfaces. So let's go ahead and add a tag here. Go ahead and execute this playbook with just that tag. I'm going to control C. Well, I didn't make it in time. I want verbose. So it's retrieving facts. Now let's look up, and we see one of the variables that comes back to us is this napalm interface list that tells us all the interfaces we have. It gives this information back to us. So here we retrieve the information, and then I'm actually just going to print it out to the screen, and then I'm going to call this test template underscore 5. Test template underscore 5. What does test template underscore 5 do? It uses that interface list in a for loop. Then I couple that with a conditional that says, if it's the management interface, skip it. If it's the VLAN interface, skip it. For every other interface, generate this config. So I no longer have it statically hard-coded in my template. I'm actually dynamically getting that list of inventories from the device using napalm facts. And let's go ahead and execute this template5.yaml. So we're retrieving the facts using napalm. We now run our templating task, and notice once again our templating task came back as everything is unchanged. It is exactly what we have from the time we executed it before. So when we executed it using that template4 playbook. Now let's remove the configs, re-execute our playbook. We're going to regenerate the configs this time. You see we've regenerated the configs. Look at one of those. You can see we have this section of configs. Now these interface names, however, these are being retrieved using the napalm get facts operation. We're using that to generate our template output. So we're basically querying the device to retrieve a set of information, and then we couple that with templating to blow out the template config.